Reading with your kids.
Hola, niho, konnichiwa, assalamu alaikum, shalom, mahaba, moni moli wanji, namaste, jambo, bienvenidos. Hi, my name is Jed Lee, and this is the Reading with Your Kids podcast. We are coming to you from the beautiful neighborhood of Reedville, in the southwest corner of Boston, Massachusetts, in the shadow of the Great Blue Hills. We are so delighted and so very honored that you are joining us in our mission to help families grow closer through reading. And we would be so very delighted if you would subscribe to the show in the iHeartRadio app, on Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you find your podcasts. We have a fascinating conversation today. Our guest is Pamela Ehrenburg. She is here celebrating her middle grade novel, Detour Ahead, a book that she wrote with Tracy Lopez, and it was written in a very fascinating way. Before we invite Pamela into the studio, we want to let you know that this episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast is brought to you by Astra the Lonely Airplane, a beautiful, fun book written by Julie Whitney. This book was written as a true labor of love, and you can feel it in the text. It was written right after Julie's husband lost his job as a pilot due to the pandemic. This rhyming picture book for kids ages 3 to 10 teaches them all about flying, math, geography, overcoming difficult situations, and most of all, having hope. It comes with a 2-page glossary and a 3-minute video of Captain Dan giving kids a tour of the real Astra. Astra the Lonely Airplane can be ordered online at Amazon and at bookstores from coast to coast and internationally. To learn more, please visit AstraTheLonelyAirplane.com. This episode is also brought to you by Cloud Monsters, a science fiction suspense story written for kids by Francine Periano Davila. Cloud Monsters follows a family trying to escape monsters that morphed from clouds and invade the earth. Are these monsters evil or good? Kids will have a fun time guessing, and they won't find out until the very end. You and your kids are going to absolutely love this middle grade action-packed thriller with twists and turns and an ending that no one would expect. Cloud Monsters is available through Amazon and other online platforms. Be sure to get your copy today. Cloud Monsters by Francine Periano Davila. Joining us right now from our nation's capital, Washington, D.C. Our guest is here today to celebrate a really fascinating middle grade novel. It's called Detour Ahead. I don't think it's about Boston, but it could be. Please welcome to the show, Pamela Ehrenburg. Hey, Pamela, how are you?
Hi, I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm excited to have you on. So I'm right, this isn't about Boston and the never-ending detours that we're experiencing here in the city.
It's actually about Washington, D.C., but we have some similar kinds of transportation issues here. So Boston readers will definitely relate.
So as this is really interesting because in the notes, we should mention right at the top that you co-wrote this book with Tracy Lopez, and you wrote it in a way that I think is the first time we've had a book that was written in this way, and that you have two main characters, and both you and Tracy wrote from the perspective of those characters.
Exactly. Yeah. It was the first time I've ever tried anything like this as well. So
Yeah.
A good time for new things to all of us.
So tell us about the book, please.
Sure, absolutely. So as you said, there's two characters. Gila is 12 years old, getting ready for her bat mitzvah. We've had some back and forth on terminology. She identifies as neuro-diverse or neurodivergent. She is riding the bus regularly to her school for the first time on her own, and she meets a kid named Guillermo who is riding his bicycle to his school, and there's an incident where the bus swerves too close to the bike. He falls off, and this begins the spark of friendship that carries them through the book. And throughout it, they navigate various detours of literal but also figurative growing up kinds of detours. As she's getting ready for her bat mitzvah, he's getting ready for a poetry reading. He is new to DC, having just moved from Maryland, and he's kind of finding his way in his environment as well. And they help each other both to navigate, and it's the start of a great friendship.
Now, with the name of Gila and Guillermo, I am taking these two characters come from very, very different cultural backgrounds.
They do, yeah. He is Salvadoran-American through his father's side. His mother is non-Salvadoran, so a bicultural, bilingual family. Gila is Jewish, and they have lots to learn from each other culturally, but also just in general.
Yeah. So neat. I look back on my middle school days, and I don't know if I was consciously aware of it, but I look back at the friends that I had, and talk about I was going to say rainbow of friendships, but it was, my friends were like this beautiful bouquet of, boy, do I sound corny. But it really was. I mean, I look back and we didn't have this term of neurodivergent, and we didn't even use the word autism. But a couple of my very close friends were definitely on the spectrum, and I had friends from different cultures, and I remember I had one friend from Latvia, and his mom spoke Latvian, and I would hear it when I would go over the house, and I would ask, hey, say something in Latvian, and he never would. I think he was embarrassed, and I'm like, no, dude, I'm really interested. I'm not going to make fun of you. I just want to learn.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. I think middle school is such a good time for minds to open and friends to, help each other along the way and recognize, how much everyone really has in common at the same time as everyone's navigating their own separate paths.
Yeah. And I think it's a really neat time, too, where you met, Gila and Guillermo, the boy and girl, and I think it's a lot easier for boys and girls to be friends in middle school than it is for them to be in high school. And I'm just guessing because I went to an all-boys Jesuit high school, so I didn't have any female friends. But it just seems like, it's just, hey, we're just buddies, and we're not really, at least, again, back almost 100 years ago, there was no one really talking about dating much in middle school. We were just going out and playing sports and being in the band and all that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And as I'm trying to think about the elementary through high schoolers that I know, it feels like when the kids are really little, boys and girls are friends. But you're right, they kind of go through a period where, you can be friends outside of school but not be seen together on the playground. It's interesting to see how the patterns, at different schools. Mm-hmm.
Now, I mentioned that you and Tracy wrote, one wrote for Gila and one wrote for Guillermo. I'm guessing with the name Lopez that Tracy probably wrote for Guillermo.
That is true, yes.
That's true, yeah. So I'm interested because authors often talk about the surprising things they learn about their characters as they're writing the book. And, you hear it sometimes, and an author would say, well, I had no idea that so-and-so was going to do this. And I know sometimes I'm listening saying, but it was your fingers on the keyboard, so what do you mean you didn't know? But in this case, you really didn't know what Tracy was going to write about Guillermo. What kind of things surprised you as you were discovering and getting to know Guillermo?
That's a really great question. I really enjoyed getting to know Guillermo better and better as the process went along. And I think especially getting to see inside his mind, I sort of had an idea from the beginning of kind of the external, how they first meet, what, when he has walk-on appearances, as Gila can see him, but to then get to experience some of the same scenes through his mind, really did lead to, I think middle school boys, it's so interesting, I think, and not to universalize,
right.
Of course,
mm-hmm.
But I think there's a lot of pressure on boys to appear brave or, to have some kind of front that to try to not appear too sensitive. Poetry writing is not something that's universally, applauded in boys in particular, I think. And so to get to see kind of that tension in him of, the kind-heartedness and sensitivity, inside his mind, and then how he navigated, a world that didn't always expect that of him. He was really a joyful person to get to know. I'm almost forgetting he's not real as we're talking about him now.
Well, characters become real for readers. They obviously become real for writers. Characters on TV shows become very real. I'm sure that at different moments when I was watching The Sopranos when it first came out, I was thinking, yeah, this is a real Tony Soprano. I could run into him down in New Jersey. I hope I don't run into down in New Jersey.
That's very true.
I'm interested in the process. Did you have a very detailed outline when you and Tracy began this journey together, or was it like, I'm thinking that Gila's going to do this, and why don't you write about what Guillermo thinks about what she's doing?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I had started the journey a little bit before connecting with Tracy. So the book was inspired by an actual incident that took place on a bus that I was riding as a passenger. And not word for word, literally, but, a similar incident that I had experienced as a passenger. And so I knew at that point somehow there was a book in some version of this. And I had started playing with Gila's sections. Actually, at that point, she was a boy, more similar to the actual incident, and the bicyclist was going to be a girl. That kind of evolved at different points. But so I had some ideas of what Gila's story was going to look like, but I recognized pretty early on that I was not the right person to write Guillermo's story. So after Tracy was on board, there were kind of some touch points of, okay, Gila is going to be doing such and such. We think it's, likely going to be around this time of year, then this other thing is going to happen. But there was this sense that there was this whole other story that Guillermo was experiencing concurrently, but, most of their interactions throughout the book take place on these bus rides that they share together. Towards the later part of the book, there's more times when they interact off of the bus separately, off the bus when they come together. But, there were a lot of the early sections where they would each be doing different things and then come together at these bus rides. So there was a lot of freedom at that point for Tracy to really explore, what is Guillermo's story that's evolving during that time.
That's neat. That's really neat. I like that idea. Tell me, you mentioned that Gila is neurodiverse or neurodivergent. In what way?
It's a great question. The book itself doesn't actually specify, a particular category.
Mm-hmm.
I think in early drafts, there were a few mentions where she identified as autistic, but that evolved out of that, by the end of it. So I don't know that there's a specific, clinical even feels like the wrong word, mm-hmm. because, so I think in terms of in what way in the broader sense, I think Gila brings a lot of strengths to the initial incident on the bus. So what happens at this first meeting is that, she is the one who, sees, Guillermo fall off his bike and insists that the bus driver stop to make sure that he's okay. And it, similar to the actual incident, that happened on the bus that I was riding, other people on the bus were not as eager to speak out in
mm-hmm.
a case where it wasn't really clear at first that there was an emergency, and it wasn't really clear that the emergency necessarily related to the actual bus. I mean, it was, she's shouting out, someone fell off a bike, and she has this very strong sense that, this is our role here to take place in that. And I think, there were so many times, various times, I think the pandemic really brought to mind for me, we need more people willing to speak out and not necessarily filter everything through, social rules that may or may not apply in different situations. So I think, neurodiverse in what way? In terms of, I think, a genuineness and a sense of staying on a clear path when there might be other pressures felt by other people to diverge, I guess, from that. So, in thinking about the vocabulary, neurodiverse and neurodivergent, I think the really challenging word for me is neurotypical, because I think there's an implication that anyone who, that there's one way to be neurotypical, and that everything else is different from that. And so I think once we can conquer that piece of the vocabulary, I might be able to have a better answer to your question. I'm glad you asked that. It gave me a lot to think about.
Well, I mean, it's the idea of neurodivergent kids. I'm always fascinated. I was before I became an educational magician. I was in human services, and I worked with kids who had severe developmental disabilities. And the kids who really fascinated me, and again, at that time, the diagnosis of autism was kind of reserved for the kids who were nonverbal and kind of rocking and whatnot. And I had a very, very clear belief that there was a lot more going on, that these kids just weren't able to communicate. And I would always try to not so much fantasize, but just was curious as to, I would love to know what's going on and to, somehow get that Elon Musk neural link and kind of click in there and just see for a minute how these kids are thinking and perceiving the world. It's just something that I've been fascinated with. And I think I think it's a good thing to kind of be curious to know how people are perceiving the world, because when we kind of respect that people are looking at the world in different ways, I think we can better understand them and better see that we're kind of all in this world together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And I really think that, we've connected with a couple different sensitivity readers at different points in the writing process. And I think what really brought me so much reassurance was to realize that everything that you just said is really so true of all kids, regardless of label, category. Those labels and categories change. It seems like every 5 to 10 years anyway, and I think that the whole experience of writing for kids in general, both middle grade, but also picture books and, anything in between. And, that I think just seeing the world from the perspective of one kid, is always the case. And so I think, it's not so much a matter of envisioning a whole population, but, I think just getting to know one person at a time is, gives me a lot of hope, I think, for the world in general and the role of books in doing that.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned again the pandemic, and I just want to make the statement out there. I think during the pandemic, we all kind of understood that while we're all in the same storm, we weren't all in the same boat. And, one of the things that really shocked me was here in Boston and other big cities, people are coming out and saying 80% of our kids in public school, 80% of the kids in the schools get their food. That's where they eat. They get their meals from school. If it wasn't for school, these kids aren't going to eat. And to me, that was like, well, this is wrong. There's a problem when 80% of our kids get their food. And so I was really happy that people stepped up and were making sure that people who were experiencing food insecurity and whatnot were fed. But I don't want us to forget that, because it's still unacceptable to think that 80% of kids or any percent of kids have to depend on a school to get their food. We need to make sure that everybody has access to good, nutritious food.
Absolutely. I think, we're about to be at a turning point, I think, in society in general, in terms of, now that we've had our eyes open, I think, to a lot of, and when I say we, I mean, I think various people had various degrees of familiarity with all these kinds of situations previously. And I think now that there is maybe an increased awareness, in some circles. So exactly what you said, so what do we do from here? Because we can't go back to where we were in 2019, because like you said, it was not acceptable in so many ways. Food, healthcare, housing, so many ways.
Yeah, I'm curious how you connected with Tracy. Were you buddies for a long time, or was this a first collaboration?
This was a first collaboration. Yeah, I actually reached out online when I realized I had sort of the potential for half a story, but it needed another author. And so the magic of Twitter, which I remember if that's how you and I first connected or not as well, but it really is amazing how, and that's another thing. I think probably the pandemic has maybe made some of these things easier. I mean, this was before the pandemic, but just the world is so big, but also so small in some ways. So, so we did first connect online. She wasn't sure at first, she, as you know, she's in a bicultural family, and we were trying to figure out, she wasn't sure if she felt like she was the right person. I mean, I had seen her writing, and I thought, she's a phenomenal writer. I would be honored to have her as a co-author. But she also wanted to make sure, is she the right person to tell the story? So, we did a bit of outreach in some other directions as well. And, all roads seem to lead back to, this being the partnership and her being the person to tell the story. So we've actually only met in person twice. I think about a year or so into our writing, we found a time my kids were away at camp, and there was a rare moment of our schedules kind of, she lives about 2 hours or so, from DC. And so we found a time to meet up, about halfway in between. And then the second time that we met in person actually wasn't until a week or two ago. We had our author copies of the book, and so we have a photo now of us holding that together. But she was in D.C. and touring some of the sites and everything. So it has been a wonderful bonus for me to end up with a new friend as a result of all this as well.
That's wonderful. I'm curious. I don't want to jinx anything. I know authors can be superstitious. Are there going to be more Pamela and Tracy collaborations in the future, do you think?
That's a great question. We haven't really talked about that yet. I think this was a perfect, I don't know if coalescence is quite the right word, but the two stories of these two characters coming together. So, it would be interesting to see. I know that I know some other co-authors have approached the co-authoring process differently, where they've both written together from the perspective of the same character, or different ways. So I think certainly if the right story presents itself, I would be happy and honored to do that. But I don't know that we've landed on quite that right story just as of yet. Yeah.
Neat. Well, I know people are going to want to know where they can go to find out more about Detour Ahead and find out more about you, and also find out more about Tracy Lopez.
Absolutely. So Tracy and I each have author websites, which I can't remember if I've already sent you, or I can make sure and send you in a way that listeners can easily get that. In terms of the book, so it was published by PJ Publishing, which originally or still has as their primary mission. They're connected with PJ Library and PJ Our Way, which is a nonprofit that gets books out, Jewish themed kidlit picture books for PJ Library, and then PJ Our Way is the middle grade division. So there's a lot of great stuff on their website as well. And then PJ Publishing has recently branched out so that their PJ Publishing books are also on Amazon for now as well. That we're working on connections with other local independents and everything like that, but as a start, PJ Our Way and Amazon.
Awesome. Well, we've had a really great time speaking to the author, one of the authors of Detour Ahead, a really fascinating middle grade novel from Tracy Lopez and from our guest, Pamela Ehrenburg. Hey, Pamela, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always such a great honor and great conversation. Thank you.
Please be sure to join us for the next episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast. Our guest will be Anika Lamers. She'll be here to celebrate Peekabond. It's a really, really neat app, and you're going to be delighted to find out all about it. You're going to really enjoy Anika. She is a delightful person. Hey, we would love it if you could connect with us on social media. Facebook.com/readingwithyourkids, at Reading With Your Kids on Instagram, at Reading With Your Kids on TikTok. Be sure to check out our at Reading With Your Kids page on Pinterest. And if you are on Twitter, please check us out at Jedley Magic. Want to thank the folks who made today's show so wonderful. Of course, we want to thank our guest, Pamela Ehrenburg. Please be sure to check out her middle grade novel, Detour Ahead. Want to thank our sponsors. Check out Cloud Monsters, the science fiction suspense story written for kids by Francine Piriano Davila. Also want to thank Astra the Lonely Airplane, written by our friend Julie Whitney. Our staff, our great team, they deserve a big thank you. Rory Grady, Fatima Khan, Skylar Strauss. I want to thank my beautiful wife for all the support she gives me. Most of all, we all want to thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. And as always, thank you so very much for taking the time to make the world a better place by reading with your kids. I'll be looking for you in the next edition of the Reading with Your Kids podcast.